Hello, I'm conductor Raffaele Ponti, and this is Behind the Notes. Today, my very special guest is Grammy Award-winning composer Kenneth Fuchs. Ken, welcome.
Thank you, Raffaele. Great to be with you again.
Thank you. Same here. Great to see you. Listen, let's get right to it. I want to ask you the same question I want to ask Beethoven someday when I meet him. What were you thinking, man? What were you thinking?
Well, when I was writing the piano concerto that you and the orchestra and Jeffrey Beagle played so brilliantly just a year ago, I was writing a work based on three paintings by Helen Frankenthaler, whose abstract expressionist art has been a great influence on my creative life since I first met her in 1983. It took about 9 months to compose that work, but I do feel it's one of my strongest pieces, and it always garners a very positive audience response, as you so well remember from our very last concert before everything stopped last March.
Right. It was a brilliant performance. The audience absolutely couldn't stay in their seats. They were on their feet the whole night. It was absolutely amazing how your composition and this performance with Jeffrey and the orchestra just spun this synergy of amazement. And the audience just was enwrapped in all of that.
Well, I was and still am very proud of that concert because I felt that we were giving the audience of Punta Gorda a very special gift at that particular time, that very challenging time that we were all enduring. And I'm so glad it was through music and with you and the orchestra and Jeffrey.
That was just a special week. When Mozart was writing for the clarinet, for example, the Mozart clarinet concerto, he obviously had a clarinetist, a wonderful clarinetist in mind when he wrote the piece. But the clarinet at that point was a different mechanism. It had its limited ranges. It had its faults at that point because the instrument was still young and was developing at that point. So Mozart had a parameter to write with, and also the player had probably a limitation because of the lack of repertoire up until that point. Sure. So my question to you is, how does composition catapult talent, and how does talent catapult composition? Because I know you've written for some really amazing players. I mean, there's nothing Jeffrey Beagle can't play. There's nothing that Timothy McAllister can't play. I mean, these people just have the top of the line instruments and an incredible technique on top of the musicianship. So how do you think that evolves?
Well, one of the things I tell my students at the University of Connecticut all the time is there is no sin in writing music that is difficult to play for any instrument. The sin is if you are composing music that is not composed idiomatically for that instrument, where you're asking a player to spend hours in a practice room trying to learn a piece that just really doesn't fit on the instrument. So certainly when I was writing the piano concerto, I'm not a pianist, but I've studied a lot of piano repertoire and have composed other works for piano. But Jeffrey Beagle is a lifelong friend. We were classmates at Juilliard in the 1980s, and I've written several pieces for him. So I knew what Jeffrey could do. And as with all of my concerti, Jeffrey and I collaborated very carefully on every step of that piece. I was sending him drafts all the time. And we were corresponding about what was working and what could be composed a bit more idiomatically, there's that word again, for the instrument. And so, yes, grateful to have the opportunity to compose for such wonderful soloists, but the music has to be worthwhile for them to spend their precious time and talent on it.
Agreed. But throughout history, for example, when Tchaikovsky was writing his violin concerto and his first piano concerto, he was writing for great players who actually were pushing back on it and said, this is literally unplayable.
Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it? Works that were once called unplayable are now standard repertoire.
They're the heart of our repertoire.
Several others. Yeah, it's amazing. But you know, William Schumann, who had been president of Juilliard and was one of my mentors when I was studying at the school, great American symphonist, as you know. He was talking about a difficult passage in one of his works, and remembered thinking when he wrote this work in the 1940s, he said, it may be difficult now, but someday this won't be difficult for a symphony orchestra. And of course he was right. Yeah, he was talking about his third symphony, which of course is his masterpiece, really, and a standard American symphony.
So he himself was talking to the fact that orchestras were improving.
Absolutely. Copland also, in the 20s, the late 20s, when he was composing his early big symphonic works like Symphonic Ode, and also his second symphony, which is incredibly challenging rhythmically, he said constantly shifting time signatures for symphony orchestras back then were a major drama. I mean, it was really difficult for them to grasp this new rhythmic language that Copland was writing in. But of course now, Copland symphonies, for the most part, are fairly regularly programmed.
Same with Stravinsky too. I mean, the same thing with the meter changes, the whole thing there too.
Absolutely.
And this is why conductors who can't conduct those pieces do that famous circle, because it'll end up someday lining up together.
I can't possibly imagine conducting a symphony orchestra, Raffaele. I mean, I have the few times I have conducted my own music, whenever I'm on the podium in front of the players, I'm thinking, why did I get myself into this? What am I doing up here? So
that's a real funny thing, is when you listen to great composers, like you said, Copland and Stravinsky and all the others conducting, but those two in particular, it's really amazing that when they conduct their own works, it sounds different than what is really on the page. Have you ever experienced that?
That's a really interesting point. Can you break that out a little bit more? I'm fascinated to hear that.
For example, in Stravinsky's Firebird, the very end of it, beam, bum, 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 beam, bum. When you see a live performance of Stravinsky conducting live himself, he asked for it to be tut, 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 tut,
really?
tut, tut, tut. And I've never heard, well, at least in modern days, an orchestra playing that way.
No, and I of course revere the Firebird, and the finale that you're talking about is, to me, one of the most spectacular moments in all of Western music. But I simply can't imagine that Allegro 7/4 with staccato dots over it, because I'm so used to hearing it played the way it's usually played.
Exactly right, which comes to a point, because nowhere in the score or any of the publications of it is it indicated staccato or with dots or anything.
Yeah.
So it was interesting on why he wanted it that way for his performances, because there's no reasoning, no indication on the material. And that's my only resource as a conductor, to be the composer's advocate.
Well, I certainly understand that, and my music, I mean, as you know from the piano concerto, is highly edited, and that comes from, of course, doing recording my music with the London Symphony Orchestra, where recording sessions simply cannot be about answering questions. The music has to be crystal clear on the page. In fact, Maurice Murphy, who was the great principal trumpeter of the LSO since 1977, until he passed away a few years ago, said to me, I think it was one of the biggest compliments I ever received. He said, "You make our job easier because your music is so clear when it's on the stand." And that's what it's all about, right?
That's exactly right. In those situations, you don't have time, or we don't have the money to sit there and fix and talk about the length of that eighth note. It has to be crystal clear, and your music is so articulated in that fashion and clear and easy to read. There's been scores that I've read from other prominent living composers that you sometimes are looking at it thinking, I wonder what they really want there.
Yeah,
it's not really clear. Or they're asking, like you said earlier, they're asking an instrument to do something, like, for example, of a trumpet to flutter tongue octaves. And it's like almost impossible to do that. What do you want?
Yeah, I really value, highly prize interaction with a conductor, and the players who are playing my music, but in a large ensemble and symphony orchestra through the conductor with the orchestra. But you know, that's what interpretation is all about to me, to have the opportunity to shape the piece with you. And I'd much rather be talking about the nature of the music or the, you know, the emotional intention of that passage rather than is that a B flat or a B natural.
Absolutely. Talking about the music is what you mean. Talking about the music.
Yeah.
This is an interesting point. You and I have the only two professions in the orchestral world or the band world or choral world or opera world where you and I don't make a sound.
Yeah.
Like by myself, I just have a stick and I make no sound on that stage. So if I don't have a great ensemble or a great orchestra or a great opera company, I don't have any sound to feed off. So therefore, I'm constantly testing my technique, my ideas to make sure that I'm being true to your score. But I only know that after I hear it. So it's this threefold thinking where I have to be knowing how to conduct the future, what's coming up. I have to show the message in the present. And then I have to be assessing quickly, did it work or not in every measure? Same thing with you. If it wasn't for a great ensemble, great musicians, you and I just have a great manuscript in front of you.
Exactly. You know, when is a piece of music actually a piece of music? When I finish writing the score and close it and put it on my shelf? No, it's when it's being performed in a live situation. I mean, if it's an acoustic work, which of course all my music is, but you know, I mean, it's interesting. It really is interesting. You know, I have really never thought about it from the perspective that you just mentioned, that neither one of us really make a sound. I need you and your orchestra as much as you do to have the piece come alive.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
You know, it's this interconnection. It's between my connection with the composer, whether they're, you know, living or not living, to try to realize what's happening. The beauty of this is that I can ask you questions in rehearsal over coffee. I can say to you, listen, Ken, what do you want to have happen here? Is this really working? And blah, blah, blah. With Beethoven or Mozart or Brahms, we can just do a lot of research, a lot of study, a lot of listening, study their chamber music to try to figure out what was their plan, what was the way it should be played, how should it be played. So it's such a relief and a wonderful idea to be able to sit with a living composer and really hash out the intention, the sound, the style, the layering of that moment, the color of that moment, the intensity or lack of that moment. And I find that to be such a pleasure, such a joy.
Well, you know what was such a joy for me with our concert also was that so many of the players in the orchestra came up to me to talk to me about the music. They had questions, and not just the principal players, like the second players. And one of the happiest, and two surprises, two or three Juilliard classmates are playing in the orchestra whom I had not seen since we graduated in the late 1980s. That was very special. And during one of the breaks, your wonderful harpist, Richard Fleischer, Dickey, came up to me and had some questions about the harp part. And he didn't introduce himself by name. And, you know, we started talking and it was a very amiable conversation. And finally I said, what's your name? And he said, Dickey. And I couldn't believe the moment, because Dickey Fleischer was a classmate when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Miami in the mid-1970s. In fact, Dickey played the first piece of chamber music I ever wrote at Miami in 1977.
Wow.
It was a really happy moment. And I continued, as I always do. That day, he had so many suggestions about harp notation. And so I'm always seeking out players of instruments, especially like harp, string players all the time. You know, technical questions, what's the best way to notate this? The best way to notate these harmonics, you know, that's what it's all about.
Isn't it fabulous? Wow. You know, and he's the son of Leon Fleischer.
Yes.
The world-class famous pianist.
My jaw hit the floor. It really did.
It just is an amazing thing. And he's such a wonderful guy and a good friend to me now.
Yes.
But he was actually playing, he has over 100 harps that he owns, and they're in his home. I mean, it's like a museum. And he was playing for that performance. There's a plaque on that instrument that says, played by Harpo Marx in the Night of the Opera.
No way. Wow.
so I'm floored by all of this type of thing.
Yeah. That's awesome, as my students say.
So, you know, like in opera music, Ken, let's talk about this. This is a thing that, for example, Jeffrey Beagle, all the great artists, Timothy McAllister, and on and on and on, that you've written for with a player in mind. Okay. Now think about it like with the opera world, for example, when Puccini or Verdi were writing arias. Yeah. Okay. They were writing with specific vocalists in mind. Yeah. Puccini was writing specifically for Caruso at some point and was sitting with him and saying, how does this feel? Or how does that look? Or, you know, does that high C work for you there? And how long can you hold it? That, you know, that kind of idea. And that's when you're taking an instrument and really finding where the sweet spot is. Yeah. You know, because if you put it in the wrong spot and it lays over the passaggio for too long, it's not comfortable for the singer and it's not going to give you the right effect that you're looking for. Nowadays, singers struggle with taking those arias and trying to make it their own, which is kind of like going from getting a tailored outfit made for you specifically to shopping off the rack musically. What's your thought on that?
Well, you know, this is a very interesting question, and I talk about it frequently with a dear friend of mine, wonderful composer David Crane, who's worked for decades on Broadway and in film musical. And, you know, he's always talking about the musical thought, the dramatic thought that the singer has to inhabit when they're singing an aria. It isn't, you know, it's not kind of standing outside the piece, looking in at it and trying to make beautiful sounds with your voice. It's being inside the music and acting it, yes, but you know, really creating a thought, your personal interpretive thought through musical sound in your voice. And you know, and I don't think that's limited to singers, right? I mean, I think it's limited to great soloists, but I think that's the point, and that's when it's the most affecting in a performance, when the soloist is living the emotional and dramatic moment of the music.
Agreed. Well said. Now, I know clearly that you were inspired by artists, and particularly a specific artist, and that inspires you, but also gives you an idea for a work.
Absolutely.
What other art forms, whether it be literature, sculpting, dance, what else inspires you and creeps into your music making?
You know, in terms of visual art, it's a few abstract expressionists of what we might call the color field school. We mentioned Helen Frankenthaler, also Robert Motherwell, and a recent piece by Morris Lewis. But I love literature. I've said a lot of words to music, but like my teacher, Vincent Persichetti, you know, a piece of literature, a poem, for instance, doesn't have to be set vocally. For instance, Persichetti's poems for piano, each one with just a small quote from a specific poem that inspires the character of each piece. They're character pieces for piano, inspired by literature. And that meant a lot to me when I first encountered that when I started studying Persichetti's music seriously as an undergraduate, even before I started studying with him at Juilliard as a grad student. But, you know, I have used that idea, that thought. My third string quartet, Whispers of Heavenly Death, is based on based on several poems from a cycle by Walt Whitman, but they're not set vocally. It's just the dramatic idea of those poems that inspired each of the movements. My recent flute concerto, Solitary the Thrush, is based on the thrush figure in Walt Whitman's epic elegy to Abraham Lincoln, When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed. There's no vocal music in that piece, but the flute soloist, takes on the role of the solitary thrush. And that's kind of what that piece is about.
Wow, beautiful. You know, Persichetti was a heavyweight. Yes. What a composer. When I speak to instrumentalists, for example, say violin players, I like to look at the lineage of what school do they come from. There's the Russian school, there's the French school, the Italian school, and on and on and on. In composition, and what I realize is, in talking about it, that we're not that far away from studying with Heifetz, because his student taught my teacher, and I studied with that teacher. You see what I mean? And it's not that far away when we think about the school of playing, the school of thought. In composition, starting back to Persichetti and before that, what school do you think you're coming from?
Well, the reason I went to Juilliard for graduate school is that when I was an undergraduate, I fell in love with the music of the American symphonists. I heard Aaron Copland, and I thought it was like glorious music. And so through that connection, through Leonard Bernstein's theater works and then discovering his symphonic works, and through Bernstein's advocacy of American symphonic music through his recordings, that was my way in. And I really fell in love with the music, Copland, Barber, William Schumann, Peter Menon, Walter Piston, Vincent Persichetti. And I also studied with David Diamond at Juilliard for 2 years. And, Diamond was a very interesting figure because he spent a lot of time traveling in Italy and in France, particularly in Paris. And, in the early part of Diamond's life, just like Ned Rorem, who was also an expatriate for a few years in the early 50s in Paris, these men spent time with the great, Gide and Cocteau and Gertrude Stein and David Diamond, even with Ravel. So that, as you said, that's an incredible thing to come up against when you're an impressionable student, to have someone who is bringing that lineage to you. But for me, it's definitely the American Symphonic School, those composers I mentioned.
It's fabulous. I was fortunate to meet David Diamond in Rochester, New York. He had actually invited me to his home.
How wonderful.
It took him months to do that. And it was a very dark, very stoic home. I walk in, he's wearing a suit. He's
Always.
very, very,
very formal.
very formal. And he sat across the room staring at me with very few words at the beginning. And then I looked over his shoulder somewhere during the conversation, and there was him as a young boy with Ravel in Paris.
Incredible. And
there's
the picture to prove it. No, it's amazing. And, of course, the composers of the American Symphonic School created, an enormous body of work. The composers I just mentioned, Schumann, Menon, Persichetti, Diamond, they all wrote 9 symphonies, and sometimes Roy Harris wrote 15. Enormous body of chamber music. It's really a very significant catalog of music by all those composers.
I think one of my I'm a big fan of Howard Hanson.
Oh, I love Howard Hanson.
I love Howard Hanson, and of course, having grown up by the Eastman School of Music.
Oh, yeah.
And he was still there to see him conduct and the whole thing. He really was the voice of a lot of these people, like Roy Harris and all these composers, with his own record label, was recording these things and pushing everything out. Yeah. And I think to myself, those were pretty edgy things for the time, for the period.
Absolutely.
And I think we've become more less tolerant of that kind of music. I think we've said the audiences, the pendulum of music, I think, goes this way. Yes. And goes that way. Of course, starting with Bach and then all the way around, and then it goes to this way. Then the 70s happened, and all kinds of stuff came in. And then John Cage arrived when we finally hit Silence as a masterpiece. And now it swings back and forth again. I find that the audiences back then were much more open to listening to new things and accepting challenges by their ears. What do you think?
Well, Howard Hanson is a remarkable figure in the history of American music. He was director of the Eastman School of Music for 40 years. And really, before other schools of music emerged, most composers, Diamond, Menon, all these, they all went to Eastman to study with Hanson and Bernard Rogers. And, for Hanson to, record so much new music for Mercury Records. And then, Frederick Fennell, who was a conducting faculty member at Eastman, founded the Eastman Wind Ensemble in 1952 and really created the cornerstone movement for developing serious symphonic wind music in the United States, and recorded all those works that he commissioned with Mercury too. But yeah, much more adventurous, I think, much more so in terms of audiences being willing to listen to something that they don't know. Composition in the United States, when I got to Juilliard in 1979, the composition faculty included Milton Babbitt, Elliott Carter, David Diamond, Vincent Persichetti, and Roger Sessions. And Peter Menon was president of the school. So that gives you a pretty good idea of, how serious composition was taken there. But, through the 80s with the return, what was called the return to Romanticism, thanks to David Del Tredici and John Adams, the end of the 80s, in terms of musical composition and writing in many different, pluralistic styles, it was very different than it was when I got there 10 years earlier, I can tell you.
It changes quick. It does change quick. It's really great. Ken, with yourself, a painter, when they have a canvas in front of them, they can work on a piece for months or a year. You do a little bit here, you feel this way about it today, you step back from it, take a look at it. As a composer, how do you do that? You write something. Have you ever had the situation where the first time through, like Mozart, it's just perfection at first? Or if you go through or go back to something, do you feel differently about it and maybe say, let me try this, or maybe adjust that in here?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's rare if the first time is absolutely the right way. But I tell my students, when you start to write a piece of music, you have to sketch. You have to go to the piano with a pencil and music paper and write down ideas for chord progressions and melodies and maybe some instrumental combinations. You have to keep doing that to that's the gift. You're hearing this between your ears. You have to respect it. And each day, when you go back to a sketch you made the day before, you're going to have a reaction to it. Either you're going to say, wow, that's really great, I want to keep going with this, or you're going to take the pencil and go X and start over and do something different. So yeah, very much like painting, for me, it's this way, that hair this way, hair that way. I'm in the middle of writing the first movement of a big orchestra piece, and it's just, that's what my life is. But, unlike a painter, or let me say, unlike a painting where you take it in all at once when you see the finished work, of course, a musical composition exists only in time. And so you have to be so conscious of how is this music coming at a listener who has never heard this piece before, who doesn't know who you are, but is it communicating? Is it, is it saying something that they understand on the first hearing? They have to understand, at least I think. I prefer to have my music understood on the first hearing if possible. That's not writing down to people. It's not writing, easy, pretty sounding music, but it's writing it in a way that's understandable, even if it's dissonant, even if,
Right, exactly right. It sounded to me that when you were describing, write down the fragments, and then if you don't like it, scribble it out. It sounded like you were describing the Beethoven sketchbook. Because if you look at his sketches and what he was doing on those long walks, it's exactly that. Little fragments of ideas that he later develops, but then it's just pages of scribble, 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 and get it out of the way because it's not going to work. So I think you're exactly describing that. What a great advice you're giving your students to do that technique there. Now, as a conductor, when I open up a score, and it could be, say Beethoven 7, say, I might have conducted it maybe 40 times. Every time I open it up, I feel differently about it.
Is it the quality of the music? I mean, is it in the music that it speaks, the music is malleable, that it has that much in it that you can think about it in different ways?
I'm not sure what it is. I think, when you're younger, you go at it like, wow, I've got this down. I heard a couple of recordings, I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to get out there and really do it. And those tempos are the tempos. And then there's always the tempo debate with, are those really Beethoven's tempos, or are they too fast? Are they too slow, actually? But then I think it's probably what I like to think it is. I'm not sure this is accurate, but the older you get, hopefully the wiser you get. and the more worldly you become, and the more you see things and you learn things, and you learn more about the chamber music element of what Beethoven was doing. If you study those quartets, that's how you learn to conduct his symphonies. And I think that with any composer, same thing with Brahms, and on and on and on. So have you ever returned to a piece of music of yours and felt differently about it?
Well, yes. And I have two works, earlier works that are actually recorded, that I think I need to, I would love to have another whack at them. They're it's like too long, it doesn't need to be quite that long. So yeah, I have a few early pieces, but two in particular. One's a concerto, one's an orchestra piece that I'd like to tighten up and record again.
Super. Any upcoming projects you can talk about?
Well, at the moment, the thing that's right in front of me is a big orchestra piece. It's also based on 3 paintings by Helen Frankenthaler, and I'm in the middle of the first movement, and it's this one. Like as you were saying, the older you get, I mean, there's a lot to think about. It's like, have I written this already? What's you don't want to repeat yourself, right?
Or did somebody else write this already?
Yeah, did somebody? Yeah, right. So, but no, this one's just taking a while, and that's okay. I mean, that's the journey of this piece. It's not as easy as it was, as you were saying when you're young. Yeah, I got this. I'm going to write this piece. I'll be done in a week. I'm not in that place anymore.
Right. Do you wake up Monday morning, 8 o'clock, get yourself ready to go, get in your music studio, look at your watch and go, okay, now I'm going to write? Or do things come to you at odd times?
Well, it's not 8 a.m. I can tell you that much. But another tidbit my students hear is composing is like practicing your instrument. You have to write music every day. And I don't write music every day, not because I don't want to. I teach, and some days I just don't get to it. But I try as much as I can to write every day. And it's for me, it's like getting the day going, but in the afternoon and even into the evening, I'll work on music. I can work like 2.5, 3 hours maybe, and then I'm tired out and I need a break, but I can go back to it. And there's always something to fix when I go back to it. And that's when I know I'm kind of really in touch with the piece.
Right. That's the artist. That's your canvas. There you go.
That's right.
Ken, congratulations on your recent Grammy. I can't think of a composer more deserving of that.
I'm very touched.
Many more to come, my friend. I'm
so glad of our musical friendship, and I really mean that.
The same here. And when you get that score done, please make sure I see it. Thank you, Ken Fuchs, and thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thank you.
Ciao.
All right.